Okay, hello everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Jeff Wasielewski. I'm the commercial tropical fruit agent for IFAS in Miami-Dade County. We'll also be getting a part of the webinar from Dr. Jonathan Crane, who put this webinar together. This is part of the new grower workshop series. We do it once a month, and next month we're going to do avocado, so we hope to see you there. Just some housekeeping. We're going to go ahead with the webinar first, and then after the webinar, we'll do a very short survey, just a 2 to 3 minute survey. And then we're going to do a Q&A, question and answer. You can ask your questions in the chat. So I'll be looking at that as Jonathan's speaking, but we're actually going to do the questions at the very end. So we hope to get your questions. So let's go ahead and get started with the mango.
And turn on the recording, right?
Got it.
Thanks, Jeff.
Sure. Try to... Oh, there we go. Of course. Okay. So the mango is grown commercially in all of these.
You have to go back. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm trying to. Technology. We'll get it going. There we go. Sensitive. Try it again. Good recording. This recording will be on YouTube, including all these outtakes. Got sort of a lag.
Do I need to go into the share and?
No, should be working. There we go. Okay, this time for real. So mango is grown commercially in all of these counties. You can see down in Miami-Dade, we have 992 acres, but look over in Lee, 1,561. So that's pretty amazing. And the total is 3,644. So quite a few acres of mangoes being grown. That's commercially. So that doesn't count all the homeowners that also have mangoes. And there's a very large number that have that. Hmm. Okay, so here we see some mangoes grown in Homestead on the left. Very nice, good sized tree full of fruit. West Palm Beach, if you look in the foreground, you can see the younger trees that have been pruned to keep them a little smaller. And I think in the back there, that's a mango, I'm pretty sure. So you see what they do if you don't prune them. And we'll talk about pruning later. Then Pine Island, you see some older trees, pretty old trees there, and they are full of fruit and they've been pruned. Looks like they've been hedged and topped. This is a type of pruning. So let's talk about factors that have enhanced and changed the mango industry. So we haven't recently had all those acres, and now all of a sudden we have a lot more. So one thing is the diversification of the US population. So you have a more diverse population, you have a more diverse palate. So they're eating more mangoes. And this is something that any business would love to see, the growth of mangoes in the per capita consumption in pounds over from 2000 to 2021. You see it straight up. And 2021, 3.66 pounds per capita. And I know that the people listening today, they're eating more than that. So we're keeping that average up. So what are some of the factors that have caused this growth? So there's been a lot of collection of cultivars from other countries and other places. There's been a selection of things that may have already been here, so they picked the best ones. There's been a big push towards education on the mango, including this webinar today. And then there's been promotion. So on the left, we see Gary Zill, who we'll talk about in a moment. On the right, in the middle there, in the orange shirt, that's Dr. Richard Campbell at the Fairchild Farm, also called Williams Grove. So he's done a tremendous amount of picking and choosing mangoes, as has Gary Zill, who's actually come up with a lot of varieties. So there's a lot of the varieties that Gary has come up with. And there in the middle, in the red shirt, that's Dr. Norris Ledesma, who worked with Dr. Campbell at Fairchild to really push and promote the mango through the Mango Festival, the International Mango Festival, which I was a part of for over 20 years. So Gary, here's Gary Zill on the left, and Gary has this amazing ability to take a leaf of a mango, crush it up, and smell it, and actually kind of tell who the parents are and where it came from. So pretty amazing. So what he did is he planted thousands of mango seedlings. So seedlings are they're going to be different from the parents. So we don't know what they're going to be. They could be great, they could be bad. So he did that. He crushed up the leaves, he smelled it. He said, okay, this one smells like maybe a Carrie and a Julie together. So we're going to grow that and see what comes out. So here's some of the ones on the right that came out of that. Sweet Tart, Orange Sherbet, Little Gem, Sunrise, Honey Kiss, Ugly Betty, Pineapple Pleasure, Pina Colada, Orange Essence, Peach Cobbler, Sweet Tart, and Venus. These are all ones that some of you may have heard of, and they're all great. So these are some of the cultivars that have just sort of in the last decade, last 4 years, come out. So you see that's a lot. And these are all new. These are all picked because they're very good. And they're either small trees, very tasty fruit, very colorful fruit. So really a big plus for mango growers, commercially and homeowners. So this is Dr. Campbell in the tub, and this is Dr. Norris Ledesma. Were put together.
Your image and voice was frozen for a while, Jeff.
Oh, it's probably the interwebs. Sure, it's going to push forward real quick. Okay, so there on the top left, you see sort of the display that was part of the Mango Festival each year. And the Mango Festival will take place again this year. And Dr. Crane and I will be there with Dr. Campbell as well. So what about marketing and sales? So we have all these great mangoes. What are we going to do with them? So we can get them to packing houses, traditional. We can get them to farm and fruit stands. We can get them to farmers markets. And we can do direct sales. A lot of these growers are just getting it straight out to grocery chains, high-end produce outlets, mail order, and straight to the consumer. maybe off the porch. How do they sell it? Social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, and websites. So social media, fruit stands. There on the far right, you see the classic Robert is here. So many different ways to sell. Here's a lot of websites, a lot of very good ones. Top there's Mango Man Homestead. So a lot of ways to sell fruit, a lot of ways to get fruit. And when you're getting fruit like this, it's very fresh, it's very tasty. So conclusions, cultivar collection. These are things that some of these people that I mentioned did. They went out, they got cultivars, they picked them, they evaluated them. So they didn't just pick them and say, okay, we're going to try this. They really grew them and said, is this good? Is this bad? Is this something that we want to put out there? Developed selection and the production of diverse mango cultivars, established producers, entrepreneurs. They saw the business opportunity of these boutique mangoes. They went with it. Promotion and education. There's a lot of education out there about mangoes if you want to look for it. Increased ethnic diversification that we talked about. Increased availability of mango fruit in the market. Certainly the multimedia's outreach and the ease of purchasing. You can go online and get a box straight to your door.
All right, thank you, Jeff.
Uh,
Let me see.
okay,
I can move
there
to
you
the
go.
next. Okay. Okay, welcome. Thank you very much, Jeff. I want to talk a little bit about the botany of mango. There's other important fruit crops in the Anacardiaceae, which is the family of mangoes that is in mangoes is in, including cashew and pistachio. Mangoes evolved in northeastern, the Indian Burmese region. There are centers of diversification and evolution, including the Malay Archipelago and Southeast Asia. There are some secondary centers of diversification where there's been a lot of germplasm brought in, and then it's crossed and commingled, and new selections have been made, and that includes South Florida, where there's been a lot of mango varieties, seedlings, and others brought in, and then people made, crosses were made naturally for the most part, and people selected new mango cultivars. So there are two main types, the Indian types, and these evolved in the subtropics of the Indian subcontinent. They're generally monoembryonic. And then you have the Indo-Chinese types, and these evolved in the tropical climates of the Malay Archipelago. And they developed what's called nucellar embryony, in which there may be numerous embryos from one seed, one of which may actually be a cross, whereas the remaining are exactly like the mother. Okay, so many of the mangoes we grow are hybrids of these Indian and Indo-Chinese types, and so there's a real mix. That's one of the things about South Florida. The advantages we have had is we've had this great diversification of mango germplasm brought in, and then there's been a lot of crossing and selection. Just to show you, so you know the seed is, or the husk, it's called the endocarp. And then inside is the embryo, and you see the cotyledons and the embryo there. So you all know that mango trees can get to be quite large, and that was a very large tree that you saw there in Palm Beach County. If they're in a soil that is a deep soil, they can have a deep tap root. However, in Miami-Dade County, they're shallow root system because of the impervious oolitic limestone rock. However, most of the roots are, even in sandy soil, probably a good 80–90% of the roots are in the top, I'd say 2 to 3 feet, and then a huge fibrous mat closer to the surface. They're mostly evergreen. The leaves do upsize slowly. You generally don't notice it that much. Um, Leaves can live up to 5 years, and they take about 40 days plus or minus to mature from when they begin to emerge. As you all probably are aware, they're terminally flowering or terminally fruit-bearing trees. The inflorescence, called a panicle, can have many, many flowers. And there are 2 types of flowers, male and hermaphrodite. Okay. Generally, flowering occurs over a 3 to 8 week period. Of course, it's influenced by temperatures before that, during that. And so sometimes we'll have 2 blooms in a year, sometimes 3. So it's very weather dependent. Okay. So, and this is just showing you, a tree in full bloom and the bisexual flowers. So you'll see there, the flower on the left has 1 stamen, and it has the ovary, the stigma, the style, the female part there. The flower on the right, this is the male flower, where you see uh, a large stamen. The inflorescence colors vary by the variety, so they can be quite ornamental. And their size can vary from year to year. This year, the panicles that have emerged, at least in this area, have been very, very large, very vigorous blooming this season. Hmm. Okay, so as I mentioned, the panicles can be, at least 18 inches long. I think they're a little bit longer this year. This is showing you a close-up of the flower, the stigma, the style, the ovary, the stamen, the floral disc. And as I mentioned, hermaphroditic flowers or bisexual flowers, staminate flowers, right? And the proportion of hermaphroditic or bisexual flowers and staminate flowers varies within the panicles. It varies among trees and among cultivars and is influenced by the climate or the weather prior to emergence and bloom, and also is influenced somewhat during the bloom. So also genetics is involved in this as well. So some varieties are more prone to produce more male flowers than others, and same with bisexual flowers. They are small. Anyway, I don't have to go into a lot of detail on this. The nectary, though, is at the base of the flower. Um, and anthesis generally occurs during the morning hours. And the stigmatic surface, the female stigmatic surface, is receptive to pollen, actually prior to the flower bud opening, but during flowering. And the ovary fertilization takes 3 to 5 days. So the pollen grain lands on the stigma, and it takes 3 to 5 days for the pollen tube to grow down the style and then fertilize the ovary. And so you're looking at successful pollination. You're looking at anywhere from 1 to maybe 15 fruit per panicle. Okay, so one of the things that is somewhat, is important is successful pollination or fertilization. So self-compatibility, and this is the ability to self or close pollinate that leads to successful fertilization of the embryo. So that means, in other words, self-compatible variety. So if you had a whole grove of, let's say, lemon zest, is it going to set fruit with the pollen from lemon zest on itself? And so the cultivars vary in their ability to self-pollinate. And so typically fruit set is a result of some self and some cross-pollination. As an example, so Edwards, which is an old-time excellent mango, It's not, it is grown commercially on a small scale. Historically, people have avoided it because it tends to not bear very much. However, in a collection of mangoes, it tends to bear quite well. So it may be somewhat of a pollination issue, but also may be some genetic predisposition or limitation of that variety as well. Um, and the other thing is that fruit resulting from cross-pollination in general is more likely to survive to harvest than fruit that's self-pollinated. Pollinators are affected by the ambient temperatures, rainfall during flowering, the native habitat that's nearby or the exotic habitat that's not nearby, other insects, the cultural practices, especially people applying any insecticides, but even fungicides during bloom can affect the pollinators. Um, and as I mentioned, the temperatures are really important. Some insects can't fly when the temperatures are too cool. So as an example, honeybees generally have a hard time flying or don't fly if the temperatures are much below about 56, 57 degrees. So you can see there can be an impact of cool weather. Your tree could be blooming, but the weather's too cool. This may cause a problem. You may not have good pollination happen, right? Because the pollinators can't fly. So who are or what are the pollinators? And the literature reports a large diversity of different orders of insects that have been reported to pollinate mangoes. And Diptera are fly species, Coleoptera are beetle species, Lepidoptera are things like moths and butterflies, and many other insects. And so I have a little listing there, honeybees, solitary bees, wasps, flies, beetles, many things, even ants, right? And then we did a recent survey of kit mango groves. We had a graduate student, Matthew Konondan, and he monitored two commercial groves and our one of our groves here at the research center over an entire season during the flowering, and he collected insects from 14 different orders. However, the most common insects found were in the orders of Coleoptera and Diptera, Hemiptera, Hymenoptera, and Thiocenoptera. And these included syrphid flies and house flies and flesh flies, small fruit flies, eye gnats, biting midges, a number of beetles, and small carpenter ants. And let me go to the next slide. Yeah, so this is just showing you. Interestingly, on this year, that year that he did that, out of the 4,564 insects that he collected from these three kit groves, only 12 were honeybees. And what I'm trying to say is that honeybees may or may not play a large role in the pollination of mango trees. It depends. I've seen some groves, we'll see a lot of honeybees in some years. Other years, you rarely see a honeybee. So it's quite variable. So obviously, these other insects may dominate the pollination services for some mango groves for some years. And some of the other insects that he found, I'm showing pictures there, such as these grass flies, blowflies, biting midges, vinegar flies, house flies, hover flies or syrphid flies, and small carpenter ants. Also thrips. And so thrips, it's sort of it's an interesting thing in the sense that thrips at a low population may actually be beneficial in pollination. However, if the population of the thrips increases dramatically, it can then become a pest and actually decrease fruit set because of the damage it causes. So there is a threshold where you have to be careful about the thrip population. So some of the recent research that's been done here, but also in South Africa, has shown that preservation or establishment of native habitats, either around the perimeter of an orchard or grove, or nearby improved the amount and the diversity of pollinators. And the mango fruit set and production was significantly higher when you had native and non-native, like honeybee insects, present. So there is an advantage to allowing native pollinators the habitat, to either establishing it, nearby or on the perimeter, or let's say down the row middles, to increase the native pollinator population, which then can be useful for fruit set production. So cultural practices, some tentative recommendations: preserve the nearby native habitat or establish a native habitat on a part of the farm. Stop mowing the grove from harvest until fruit set following year. You want to have a water source, if possible, available for the pollinators, and avoid insecticide use prior to and during the flowering period, right? So honeybee, you can place honeybee colonies in or adjacent to your grove as well. That will help. And improve the diversity of the non-mango landscape in and adjacent to the mango grove. And what you're seeing in that picture below, what you're seeing in that picture below, we have a mango collection here at the research center. And after harvest, I basically ask our field staff to stop mowing and herbiciding the mango grove, and not to resume mowing until after the trees have flowered the following spring, like now, and set fruit. And so the idea is we're trying to build up these native pollinators in the grove over the winter, through the fall, late summer, fall, winter, and then in the spring through the fruit setting period. After it's set fruit, then we can go in and mow the grove. So flower-inducing conditions, healthy trees. That's a real big one. You need to have a healthy tree to have a good bloom and good fruit set. The trees do require a period of dormancy in order to flower. And this dormancy can be imposed. It's called quiescence, but it can be imposed by cool temperatures or dry soil conditions, or both. And the length of this dormant period during the fall and winter to induce flowering depends on the variety. Some varieties, they may only need 3 weeks of dormancy to flower, something like Edwards and some others, where others may need even up to 2 to 3 months of dormancy in order to flower well, right? So also excessive nutrient applications, especially nitrogen, may reduce flowering potential and fruit quality. So you need to be very careful about your fertilizer regime, especially with nitrogen, right? As we warm up during the late spring, or now, warming temperatures and some increased soil moisture, either from rainfall or irrigation, will many times kick off the emergence of the panicles and the flowering. I would just have a little note there, large mature trees may not need to be irrigated, just depends on the soil type, the grove, the age of the trees, what's the weather been like, are you in severe drought conditions, or is it more normal conditions with some soil moisture? So it is a fleshy drupe, and you all are very familiar with the different sizes and shapes, and the fact that they can be small, 2 ounces, and they can be 5 pounds, maybe more. Depends on the variety, depends on the crop load, it depends on the season. So this is a little bit about environmental parameters. And this is important because there is a lot of interest in, and in fact, there's already been some significant mango planting in Central Florida. There always has been in Palm Beach and Lee counties and a few other around Lake Okeechobee and places like that. But we're seeing a definite increase in the desire to plant, or that have been planted, mango groves in Central Florida. And so I just wanted to put this out here. If you look at the optimum growing temperatures for mangoes, you'll see the range there, 75 to 86. Those are optimum temperatures, right? However, the freeze damage range for mature trees is somewhere around 25 degrees. And of course, whether a tree or whether a grove is damaged by freezing temperatures depends on, how cold does it actually get? Maybe it gets to 22 degrees, maybe it gets to 24 degrees, right? How often does that happen? In other words, what's the frequency of the freeze events? Is it one time of year or is it 4 times per year, right? Also, the duration of the freezing or below 32-degree temperature. So is it for an hour or is it for 16 hours? That also plays into it. And also the stage at which the trees are growing. So if the trees are quote unquote not growing or dormant and you have freezing weather, they will tolerate the cold temperatures better than if they're flowering or setting fruit, right? So you could have a wonderful planting, it's in full bloom or it's setting fruit, you have a freeze and it kills the panicles and damages the leaves. So there's a lot of things that play into the tolerance of these trees for freeze damage. And of course, this is for a mature tree. You got to remember, younger trees can take less cold. And so they may begin to be damaged or killed at 28 degrees. So you need to think about that when you are selecting a site to plant mangoes and in the cultural practices that you're going to practice and also in the grove infrastructure. So if you're going to try to protect the trees from cold weather by an irrigation system, you need to make sure it's an irrigation system that's adequately built and designed to help protect young trees at least from freezing damage. Or if you're going to use flood irrigation between the rows of beds, you need to make sure your pumps are functioning properly to get the water onto the grove between the rows and also to come off of the grove after the freezing event. So there's planning to be made, especially with respect to cold temperatures, which is really the major limiting factor to mango production in Florida. And I do realize, we are in a warming climate. The number of freezes, the duration, and the depth of the freezing temperatures has somewhat gotten less in the past 10 to 15 years. But this does not mean we can't have a significant freezing event in the future, right? So you need to be prepared if you're going to attempt this. Heat damage, this ranges, temperatures above about 104 degrees can begin to cause some issues, especially with the fruit, sunburn, things like that, right? So I already mentioned about, a late freeze or frost can end up killing your flowers. Sensitivity to constant winds, they're moderately tolerant of that. Moderately flood tolerant, although I can tell you that, while they're flooded, they will not be growing. They're more or less just static. And so they may survive, but they're not going to be very productive if they're constantly in wet soils or flooded. Also, salinity, they really don't tolerate saline soils or water very much. And that's a difficult situation. They are drought tolerant, but in some cases, depending on the age of the trees, the size of the trees, and the weather conditions, it would behoove you to have an irrigation system at least available to irrigate the trees if need be, right? Just several comments. Temperatures in the mid to low 40s or lower during bloom may reduce fruit set, partly because of what I said before, is the pollinators can't fly, but also because those temperatures will actually cause a chilling damage to the ovaries. And so it may be delayed, so the tree may look like it sets fruit. The fruit may even get to golf ball size and then begin to drop off. If you open it up and look at the embryo, excuse me, you'll see that the embryo has been damaged. Okay. The other thing too is that's important with mangoes is that they're highly susceptible to powdery mildew, which can occur during cool, dry weather, and to anthracnose if it's wet and warm. So you need to be monitoring the grove and preparing for that prior to and during the flowering period. So we've already mentioned this, optimum Yeah, well, mangoes are grown in a wide range of subtropical and tropical climates and many different soil conditions. Um, and here I talked a little bit about the optimum for shoot growth and that, temperatures greater than about 59 are required for shoot growth, right? And root growth is generally best somewhere above 70 degrees. So I've already mentioned this, just to reiterate, requirements and conditions for flowering, that you have a dormant period and that the dry soil conditions can also enhance that. And that the longer the shoots are dormant, the more likely and intense will be the flowering response once the shoots do begin to grow again. And that's what happened this year. We had a lot of cool weather, dry weather, and when it finally did warm up and the trees began to send out panicles and flower, it was very, very intense. And you generally want warm temperatures during the bloom. So you can read this. It's basically what I've said before. It's just in a little bit more detail. And I apologize for the 20 degrees C, that's 68 degrees Fahrenheit. 30 degrees is about 86 degrees Fahrenheit. So, during flowering, so what are the conditions during flowering? As I said, you want to have temperatures, the base temperature is somewhere around 54 to 59, but in excess of 65 is better. And you can see, I mentioned before how the temperatures can affect the proportion of perfect and male flowers. Okay, and cool temperatures or very high temperatures can be a problem for fruit set. And I already mentioned about the cool temperatures also being a problem for fruit set, right? So we want higher temperatures above 60s into the mid 80s during fruit development, and we want non-limiting soil moisture. In other words, if we're experiencing severe drought, they may need to be irrigated depending on their size and your location and the soil type. So site selection and soils, site selection is really key. Areas with reduced potential for freezes, Miami-Dade County, near the coastal areas, South Central Florida and South. If it's not possible, I already mentioned, then a cold protection system is really imperative to have a plan, whether that's going to be a flood irrigation system or a micro irrigation or high volume micro irrigation system. They want well-drained soils. In some places, you're going to want to put the plants on beds. And you don't have to have soils that are fertile. In fact, having soils that are not really fertile is to your advantage in the sense that you can control the growth much more easily than if you have a fertile soil that's supplying nutrients to the tree constantly, which may enhance the tree's predisposition to just keep growing vegetatively and not flowering fruit. Okay. So general infrastructure, land prep, grove layout, irrigation system. And so, micro irrigation micro sprinklers can be used for watering and potentially also for fertilizing, whereas drip is the same thing, watering and possibly fertilizing. In some of the sandy soils, drip irrigation, you may end up having to put more than one line because of how drained the soil is, excessively drained, and or because it doesn't hold very much water, right? If you have an area where you have access to high volumes of water, you may put in a high volume system. We call it a high volume system for cold protection. And then again, I've seen some places where people could use a flood irrigation system to protect the trees during a freeze event. Wind machines are not common in Florida, and this is because they're used mostly in areas that experience what we call radiation freezes, where you have warm air above cold air near the surface, and then you mix that air. If you're in an area that doesn't have many of these type of freezes, but more has the windy type freezes or advective freezes, the wind machine's not going to be any good. So this is something you need to think about. What types or what are the more common types of freezing events you have in your area, your specific area? Many cultivars. South Florida is blessed in that it probably has over 600 different varieties of mangoes, and there are many, many to choose from. And so I'm just showing you a smattering of monoembryonic and polyembryonic mangoes. There are many, many more. Just to show you, there are hundreds in South Florida. A good place to see them are at many of the different mango events that happen during mango season. There are events in Miami-Dade, Palm Beach County, Lee County, other counties. Just to show you again. So huge diversity, and I'm going to hand it over to Jeff.
Thank you, Jonathan. Oh, it's working. So I put a couple things in the chat. I put pesticides that are labeled for mangoes, so you guys can get that. I'll put it again in the chat next time Jonathan takes over. I also put a really good publication by Dr. Crane called Growing Mango in the Home Landscape that has just an amazing amount of information. It's probably 15, 20 pages. So that's there. And I had a few questions in the chat about getting this presentation. This will be on YouTube pretty quick. And if you search in YouTube, New Growers Workshop Mango, you should find it. Okay, so I think that's all for now. And let's get going. Some selected old-time favorites, mangoes, and this group of slides right here is really amazing that Dr. Crane put together. So you're going to see a lot of cultivars with really good pictures and information that goes with it. Okay, the classic, the old time commercial mango from way back when. It's big, it's red, it ships well, productive, moderately disease resistant, vigorous tree though. And when we see that nowadays, we don't want a vigorous tree or even semi-vigorous. We want a tree that's going to be a little slower, a little easier to keep small. And keeping trees small is great for many reasons. And we'll talk about pruning a little bit later. So this is Tommy Atkins. And this is Kit. This one is late in the season, very late. So this might be one that if you want to have sort of different mangoes throughout the whole season from May to August, September, Kit would fill that last group. And this is a moderately vigorous tree, good to excellent pulp quality. Kent, Kit and Kent, I always think of them kind of together. Kent is another late one, not quite as late. Excellent pulp. Another vigorous tree, but it does get anthracnose, those little black spots, that little fungus. Very productive. Van Dyke, you can see the color there. Obviously, very beautiful, productive, moderately susceptible to anthracnose. Another vigorous tree. You see a lot of these old classics. They're very big, vigorous trees. This was before we started selecting for the, I don't want to say dwarf, but the more compact trees. And this is a June, July. Palmer, another beauty. Moderately productive, can get anthracnose, moderately vigorous tree. It's July, August, so it's on the late side. Irwin, another great red one. And typically when you see those little red, those little white dots, which you see in the mango to the right, that usually means it's from a Hayden. It's a seedling of a Hayden. So not sure about this, but I think it would be. Moderately productive, susceptible to anthracnose. So we don't love that. Moderately vigorous, good quality pulp, and then June, July. And then obviously, if one of these cultivars is one that you just love and you've got to have it, then don't let me sway you against it by saying it's vigorous or susceptible to anthracnose. You love what you love. Glen, this is one I really like. I have a few Glens here at the extension office. Fair to good fruit production, moderately susceptible to anthracnose, but low to moderate tree vigor. So this is one I can almost tell if I look at a Glen tree that it's a Glen because it doesn't go straight up. It goes sideways. It has a very unique shape where it branches sideways. Pulp, good to excellent, and it's a June, July. Hayden, you see those spots, those little spots on the right. This one is another way back classic. This one was one of the first cultivars to be chosen in South Florida. Fair to good production, susceptible to anthracnose. Unfortunately, vigorous tree, excellent quality pulp, and it's a June, July. A lot of people love this one. Valencia Pride, this one's longer, good fruit production, susceptible to anthracnose, vigorous tree, and it's a July, August, so it's later. A lot of times with these bigger fruit, they're going to be later. Ruby, great color, can be different sizes you see there, moderately susceptible to anthracnose, good production, moderately vigorous, so you could probably keep it down with some annual pruning, good quality pulp, and it's July, August. So even though this one's a little smaller, it's more on the late side. So the seasons are, this mango season is really kind of late May to early September. So when I say late, it would be like late July, August, September. Early would be May, June, and then in the middle, June, July. Florigon, this is one. I have two trees here. It's usually a very heavy producer, and it says here harvested June, July, but in my grove, this is the one that always comes first. I always know that when these are ready, then the season is starting. Good production, moderately susceptible to anthracnose, moderately vigorous tree. The trees are pretty big. Pulp, good to excellent. It's a favorite around here. Saigon, good production, moderately susceptible to anthracnose, moderately vigorous, pulp, good to excellent, and harvested in June, July. Someone's saying the slide is not displayed. Is everybody getting that? Hopefully you are. Okay, David sees it, so we're good. Namdak Mai, this one is very interesting shape, fair to good production, moderately susceptible to anthracnose, moderately vigorous tree, and excellent quality, and harvested mid-season, June to July. And this was one I remember at Fairchild. We had a auction for fruit, and this one was the highest bid, well over $100 for just a plate. Okrum, good production, moderately susceptible to anthracnose, moderately vigorous, pulp good quality, harvested in June and August. And you guys can see all this great information that Dr. Crane put together here. I mean, this is something that I hope you seek out on YouTube and show to other people. I know I'm going to steal a few of these slides for myself. Carabao, fair to good fruit production, moderately susceptible to anthracnose, moderately vigorous tree. Well, so far we're getting vigorous or moderately vigorous with our trees. And these are all, remember, these are all the older classics. And pulp, good quality, harvested June to July. And the peel is greenish to yellow. See the yellow there. So we don't always have red and orange. And yellow fruit are now in the last maybe 5 to 6 years, becoming much more acceptable commercially. All right, so those were the classics. What about the new ones? We kind of looked at some of the new ones when we talked about Gary Zill and Dr. Campbell and Dr. Ledesma. So what's old that's new and what's new that's new? So some of them are new, but some of them were classics that were kind of forgotten about. So we went back and we pulled them out and made them fresh and new. So this one is often called Tebow or sold as Tebow. Originally it was Young, so this is kind of one of the old ones that is new. And it's an Edward. This is one that we know the parents. It's an Edward by Kent 14. So we talked about Kent. We didn't talk about Edward. Jonathan mentioned it early. It's a kind of shy bearer, but really great flavor. And actually, I've found with the Edwards, when they drop on the ground, that's the best time to grab them and eat them. Or that's when they're most at their peak of maturity. So this one is young, flavor good to excellent, low fiber, and season is mid, so that would be June to July, and we would eat it fresh. Tree is vigorous though, as is Edward and Kent, so that makes sense. Angie, this is one I have in the grove here, and I really like it. I only have to prune it maybe every other year, if that, because it's very compact. So flavor, good to excellent, fiber, very low, and disease resistance, low, season early, and tree, low vigor, manageable. That's what I mean by I don't have to prune it that often. Some trees I have to prune every year, otherwise they'll get out of hand. Angie, no. Fairchild, no. Namdak Mai, no. And the Angie actually will break buds. When I talk about pruning later, we'll talk about breaking buds, like getting multiple shoots from one. And the Angie does it on its own, which I think is really cool. Malacca, excellent flavor, good production. Tree is moderately vigorous. And this is one that you have to pick it a certain way. You have to let it ripen off the tree or let it mature off the tree. Otherwise, you get not a good flavor. Raposa, big, beautiful. This is one of the older ones that has come back into favor. Excellent flavor, good to excellent production, disease resistance fair. Tree is vigorous. Cogs Hall, this one, out of all the trees I've ever grown or seen, this one is the most compact. And this is another one that you can kind of look at and know that it's a Cogs Hall. I've got two here, and one of them is so small, and I planted it maybe 8 years ago, and it's still 6 feet. The other one, however, is bigger. It's about 12 feet and needs to be pruned, but it has not been pruned all these years. So this one is very compact. Good to excellent flavor, production, good. Early to mid season. So we're talking about early June, July, maybe end of May. Mahashanook, very unique size or shape rather, and beautiful color. Very good flavor, very low fiber. We're always looking for low to no fiber, mid to late season, and moderately vigorous. So this would be another one that was kind of older, but we pulled it back because it was so good and it just wasn't getting the attention that it should. Pupu Kalai, this one was reborn as lemon meringue. So you hear a lot about this one. Very good flavor, low to moderate production, however, low fiber, disease resistance low, and season is mid, and a moderately vigorous tree. Lemon zest and coconut cream. So now we're getting into the Gary Zill cultivars. These were ones that he found using that technique of taking a seedling, breaking the leaf and smelling it and saying, okay, let's grow this one. They grow it up and then boom, out comes lemon zest, out comes coconut cream. So just amazing what he's done. And that's all you hear about these days are the new ones from Gary Zill and some of the new ones from Richard Campbell. More Gary Zill, peach cobbler, small, excellent quality fruit, but a vigorous tree, and sweet tart, mid-season, strong flavor. Fruit thinning. This is something when you have these smaller fruit, a lot of times they'll put a lot of fruit on one panicle, and you need to go in there. Let's say you have 6 fruit on one panicle. You need to go in there and take out 3 or 4. You thin it out so those remaining fruit can fatten up a little bit. Rosy Gold. This one is one that was promoted by Dr. Campbell, Dr. Ledesma, at Fairchild. It's super early. This would be one of the earliest mangoes. Very good flavor, very good size. The tree is low vigor, so this one is a winner. Another Gary Zill, Juliet. You see it's got some color issues there, but looking still delicious. Fruit similar to Julie. So Julie, Juliet. Julie is a very sought after mango from the Caribbean, and it's hard to grow here. So if you could get something that is similar to Julie, then you got a winner, and that's Juliet. Early gold, early season, excellent quality, moderately vigorous. That I don't know for sure, but that looks a whole lot like an Edwards. So I'm gonna guess that that's one of the parents. Ugly Betty. This is another Gary Zill. Mid-season, excellent flavor, but production is low. Harvest Moon, beautiful color. Another Gary Zill. This is a large fruit, but a vigorous tree. Mid to late season. So this might be one you want to put in if you want to get that whole season. So you get a Rosy Gold, you get a Glen in the middle, or a Fairchild, and then you get a Harvest Moon, you get the whole season. Pickering, this one came from Walter Zill, so related to Gary Zill. Early, June, July, and productive, low vigor, so that's good, but fair quality. Pineapple Pleasure, another Gary Zill, another beautiful colored sized fruit there. And Orange Essence, another Gary Zill. Wow, a lot of Gary Zill. Excellent flavor, so both of these. And then mid to late season for the Orange Essence. Pina Colada, another Gary Zill. Low vigor tree, which is good. Small, good, tart fruit. And Fairchild. This is one that, again, was promoted during the Fairchild International Mango Festival. And smaller, turns yellow. And it's not named after David Fairchild. It's named after the Fairchild family. This one came from Panama, was where it was selected. Excellent quality, low vigor tree. So there's another one that I have in the grove here that I prune maybe every other year rather than every year. So very manageable, pretty good producer. So this is something that's pretty amazing. I know it's hard to see, but you have all the months there and from January to December. And then this is showing you the mango on the left, the mango phenology. So this is when the flowers are coming out, when they're fruiting, when they're flushing leaves, when they're dormant. So that's pretty amazing. And then on the right, you have some mid-season mangoes where he's showing kind of the same thing, but the actual cultivars when they did that. So Dr. Crane and a lot of other researchers did a lot of work on this. They took a lot of notes, and this is what came out. So pretty amazing. So I'm going to finish up with some alternatives to kit. So what that means is kit is something that you're not just going to eat mature, but you can eat it early, crunchy, like a green fruit. You're going to eat it sort of like an apple. So what else besides kit can you do that? Because they will sell kit early in the season as a green fruit. So there's fralon, so you can eat that as a green fruit. Nam Dak Mai, Kia Savoy, Valencia Pride, and you notice a lot of these have that same shape. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Crane. He's going to talk about mango propagation.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Thank you. Okay, just a little bit about mango propagation. Um, we use polyembryonic seedlings, and these typical ones might be turpentine or number 11. There's also many criollo types or wild mangoes that are also polyembryonic. And we use those because they generally produce a very vigorous seedling, and that can be grafted quite easily. And the fact that when it's polyembryonic, it means that that seedling is identical to the mother plant. If you have a seed and you plant a seed, and let's say there's 10 seedlings come up from that one seed. I mentioned this previously, one of those seedlings may be actually a cross, a hybrid. That's not, so that would be a zygotic seedling. So it's a cross between the mother and the father. That one is going to be different and behave differently than the polyembryonic seedlings, where they actually arise from the tissue of the mother plant and they're identical genetically to the mother plant. And why is that important? Is that because if you have a uniform rootstock, then when you graft your scions onto it, the trees will behave more similarly than if you plant it onto a hybrid rootstock or a zygotic rootstock, because of the crossing. It's a hybrid and it will influence the tree's growth and performance uh, differently than a genetically identical rootstock. So typically they're veneer or cleft grafted. They can also be patch or T-budded. And actually mature trees in some cases can be worked, top worked to new cultivars. And that is also a potential for changing the varieties if you find you don't like the variety you're growing. Sorry. Okay. So considerations and recommendations for plant spacing. So part of it has to do with how long is that grove going to be there? Is it going to be there for 20 years, 40 years? That will influence the infrastructure and the layout of the grove. Of course, the climate. So in warmer areas, the trees tend to be more vigorous than in cooler areas, right? And also the inherent vigor of the tree. And Jeff did a great job at talking about vigorous trees, moderately vigorous trees, and much less vigorous trees. And so if you have less vigorous trees, like let's say the Fairchild, or that's going to be an easier tree to control and maintain. You can probably plant it at a closer spacing than if you're planting something like Valencia Pride, right? And also, what is the ultimate tree size that you desire? And that is going to be productive, remain productive, okay? And also, if you have an irrigation system, groves that don't have irrigation, the trees, during dry periods are going to be less likely to grow than trees that have access to irrigation or water, right? So historically in Florida, the spacing in the row has ranged between 15 and 30 feet and between 18 and 30 feet between rows. We've been generally recommending somewhere between 20 to 25 feet in row and 22 to 25 feet between rows. As I mentioned before, closer spacings may be possible with non-vigorous cultivars if they're under a tree size control program. And that's a key factor. If you're not going to implement a tree size control program, you're going to want to use much wider spacings. So crop production strategy is that you want to have young trees and train them to build a strong, complex tree canopy. You want to maintain a pruning program for the full canopy to be in sunlight, exposed to sunlight. In fact, the terminal leaves and shoots have to be exposed to sufficient sunlight in order to flower and produce fruit uh, productively. If they're shaded, and you'll notice this, if there's a mango tree and half of it's in the sun most of the time and half of it's in the shade most of the time, most of that fruit production is going to be on the sunny side, right? Also, another thing too about pruning is it can synchronize all the shoots, right? So sometimes you'll see big old mango trees, right? And they're not under a pruning program. And you'll see part of the tree is blooming, part of it is growing leaves, part of it is dormant. And so that tree is not synchronized. All the shoots are behaving individually, right? That's not a very productive tree. So if only 30% of the canopy flowers, that's only a 30% potential crop for that tree. By pruning all of those terminals after harvest, you synchronize all those shoots so that the next time it flowers, it's going to be more like 90 to 100% of the terminals that flower. So you have a much greater potential crop that year, right? And also the timing and the frequency of nutritionals or fertilizer can influence the production of the tree. If you over fertilize with nitrogen, the tree is going to be more predisposed to just grow leaves. It's also going to affect the fruit quality negatively. Irrigation is another factor. So for young trees, I'm talking about trees that are, let's say, up to 4 or 5 years old, um, they may need to be irrigated during severe dry conditions, whereas an older tree that's 15, 20, 30 years old may not need to be irrigated. So you need to watch that and limit the irrigation, especially after harvest, and you get into the fall and the winter. You really shouldn't be irrigating your trees much, if at all, during the fall and winter. Why? You want that tree to go dormant, right, to set itself up to flower in the spring. If you are irrigating it, and we have some moderately warm temperatures, that tree may grow another shoot, another set of leaves. It may flush again. That will decrease the chances of it flowering on that shoot in the spring. So irrigation management is important, and the timing of it. Nutrition, I've talked about this, that you don't need fertile soils to be successful. Ideally, you'll want to periodically take some leaf samples and look at the levels and compare those leaf nutrient levels to some standards, right? If nitrogen applications do appear to be warranted, you want to be using very, very low rates. A lot of the early research on mango trees was done with fertilizers that were readily available, readily soluble. And that has changed. Most of the fertilizers, if we're talking about conventional fertilizers, now have an organic or a slow release component to them. So the rates that were used in the distant past tended to be much higher. Why? Because you would put your fertilizer out, it would solubilize, and then basically wash away with the heavy rains. Now, the fertilizers, as I mentioned, are more slow release. Those materials remain in the soil profile available for use over a much longer period of time. So the rates can be drastically reduced compared to what the research had been done with the more soluble materials, right? Moderately high rates of potassium have been observed to be beneficial for improving fruit size and the internal fruit quality. I've already talked about nitrogen and being cautious with that. Of course, the secondary or minor elements should be applied on an as-needed basis or a maintenance level, excuse me, to maintain tree health. And like I said, leaf analysis is a good tool to use periodically. And what I'm showing you here is some leaf ranges for mature trees that were determined through research, both in 3 different areas, on our limestone rocky soils here in South Miami-Dade, but also on the acid sands and on the muck soils. And this work was done quite a while ago, but that doesn't change the fact that it was valid work, right? And so you can see the ranges there that you can compare the leaf levels from your leaf samples to those of these standards. I'm going to talk a little bit about phenology, or the growth stages of mango trees. And this is a very generalized phenology just to give you a feel for, what it looks like, right? And so this is increasing, right? And here's the months of the year starting in November, actually, on through October. And here are some temperatures. These are just some average temperatures to show you, how the temperatures increase during spring and summer. They peak in summer and they start to tail off in the fall, right? So here you can actually see that it's actually during November where most of the shoots are changing from vegetative shoots to reproductive or potentially flowering shoots. And the flower bud development increases during this fall, early winter period. And then flowering commences and fruit set commences, on through March, even into April, right? And then we add in here fruit growth. So you can see it sets fruit during this period, and the fruit begin to develop, right? Flowering and fruit set, and then fruit development. And then you start to see the harvest once we get into, May through September, right? Just very generalized. This is sort of how the trees grow. This is a generalized production calendar for mangoes. And you'll see here the months of the year, here in this case, starting from January through December. And on this left-hand side is the operation. So disease control. So definitely during January and February, when we have cool, dry weather, you need to be looking out and trying to prevent powdery mildew from affecting the panicles and the flowers. It can absolutely eliminate fruit set and fruit production for that year if you do not watch out for powdery mildew. So when you get into April through September, anthracnose on the fruit becomes more of an issue because it's hot, wet, and high relative humidity, right? You also want to be monitoring for flower pests during this period. As I mentioned, thrips could be a problem if they're at too high a population during the flowering. So you need to monitor for that. And then during the year, you need to look out for scales and things like that. And it's much easier to take care of a problem prior to it bursting out into a huge infestation, right? And then here's this fertilizer program and NPK 1 to 2 times a year. This is potassium, and maybe potassium, so you want to break it up. The secondary elements, basically anytime March through October. And why am I emphasizing March through October for the iron and the secondary elements? And that's because the uptake of elements is higher during warm periods. During November, December through February in general, it's harder for the plant to take up water and nutrients because it's cool. The tree doesn't transpire as much. And when it's not transpiring, it's not capable of taking up much in the way of nutrients. So by sort of front loading your tree with nutrients during the warmer part of the year, it should get you through the cooler part of the year and keep the tree healthy. That's the idea, right? Irrigation, as I mentioned, it's something you need to monitor and watch for depending on, conditions and the trees and the age of the trees, the size. Weed control on an as-needed basis. And as I mentioned before, I basically, after harvest, stop trying to mow and do any herbiciding and controlling the weeds because I want to build up that native pollinator population. Harvest, May through September, basically. Pruning, so you want to prune after the harvest. And so sometime in here, depending on the variety, the cultivar you're growing. And then this period here, November through February, for frost protection. Okay. So this is just to show you a mild iron deficiency. Here's zinc, and zinc is you have this rosette of tiny leaves, and the veins, the middle vein tends to be very hard and coriaceous, and you'll see this little rosette of leaves. This is a good indication you've got a zinc deficiency. So water management, as I mentioned, in some production areas, it will be important, the timing and the amounts. And so, as I mentioned previously several times, mature trees may only need to be irrigated during prolonged severe droughts. Over irrigation may actually increase disease problems on the leaves and the fruit, especially if it's getting wet, right? Young trees, will require some irrigation to get established, and especially during severe drought conditions. And again, it really depends on the environmental conditions and the trees conditions, right? For cold protection, as I mentioned, in some areas that have access to high volumes of water, a high volume system may be beneficial in protecting the trees from a freeze event. The use of micro sprinklers, and micro sprinklers implies in a lot of people's minds, very low volumes of irrigation. And that's not the case. It depends on how the system is designed. You can have a micro sprinkler that puts out 10 gallons per hour per micro sprinkler, right? But you can have another system that puts out 40 gallons per sprinkler per hour. So it depends on how you design the system and whether you're going to need that system for not just irrigation or fertigation, but also for cold protection. So this is something that needs to be considered when you're establishing a new grove and you don't have access to enough water, or you can't get a permit from the water management districts for a high volume irrigation system, but you can for a micro sprinkler irrigation. And trunk covers are something that we're going to probably hear more about using. It was very commonly used and still is used in the citrus industry to protect young trees from freezing, and has been used to a limited extent on some tropical fruits. Sapodillas come to mind. But this is something that people need to think about if you're establishing new groves in Central Florida, is using trunk covers on these young trees to protect as much of the wood, the trunk wood, as possible from potential freeze damage. And we'll have a workshop on freeze protection later this year where we'll probably talk about this much more. So here's a high volume system. That's an overhead system, which is not common anymore, but this is a high volume system where you're covering the entire canopy with water to protect it from freezing, and a high volume under tree system that shoots up maybe 6 to 8 feet into the canopy. There's a lot of things that go into managing these properly, designing these properly. This is just a very brief overview. You really have to know what you're doing. Otherwise, you can end up damaging or killing your trees if the system's not run properly or maintained properly. Tree size control, and this is something that Jeff's going to talk about, the tree training. I just want to mention some things about tree size control. The whole idea is you want to maintain fruit production throughout the entire tree, all along the sides and the lower canopy areas. You don't want to lose that lower canopy of the tree, which can produce fruit. You don't want to have a tree where your first fruit to harvest is at 9 feet, where you could have fruit starting from 2 or 3 feet all the way up to the top of the tree. It also, pruning improves the light penetration into the tree itself, but also among the rows of trees, right? So they're not shading each other. Also improves air movement, which dries the canopy out and reduces the disease pressure, right? I also mentioned that, the shaded stems may not flower or set fruit, so they need exposure to full sun. Also, it's easier when you control the size of the trees. It's much more efficient for foliar applications, whether that's for disease control or insect control, or for nutrient applications, for fertilizer applications. And it's also much more efficient for picking the trees either with a picking pole from the ground or with picking machines. And even those picking machines can only go up so high, generally 18, 20 feet. So trees higher than that, you've got nothing but wasted production way up in the top of this 30-foot tree, right? Lastly, what's really important, especially for hurricane-prone Florida, is it reduces the potential for windstorm or hurricane damage. And we did a lot of work after Hurricane Andrew. Carlos Belardi, Richard Campbell, and we did a lot of work after Hurricane Andrew, which was a Category 5 storm. And we found that trees much above 18, I'm talking about mango trees, 18 feet were more likely to be either pushed over or actually pulled out of the ground. And so that's another reason to control the size of your trees. You don't want to spend after a hurricane, the next 9 months trying to put your trees back up. And yeah, training. So training young trees in general historically has not been common, although this is becoming more common. It is practiced in other production areas quite a bit. And it is being promoted as a practice to increase tree density per acre, right? Because you're controlling the size of the trees and the canopy of the tree, improving crop production and the efficiency of cultural practices. And this can be done either by hand pruning or by machine pruning, or a combination of the two. So it doesn't have to be one or the other. And as I mentioned, the size of the trees that you're going to want to have will vary with the environment, the plant spacing, the available technology to prune the trees, the frequency of storms, and of course, as Jeff went over, the cultivar growth habit. Is it a vigorous variety or is it a less vigorous variety? And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff.
Thanks so much, Dr. Crane. So Dr. Crane, Jonathan just gave you a whole bunch of reasons why you want to keep your tree smaller. And now I'm going to tell you how you can do that. So equipment needed to do that is pruning shears, your little hand pruners, loppers, machete. I will go with a handsaw. Machete is a little hard for me to do a great job with. You got to have a plan, definitely dedication, because when they're younger, you need to be out there tipping, which we'll take a look at. And then when they're older, you need to get out there at least once a year after after you pick that last fruit and prune them. And as they get older, it gets harder and harder. So when to start pruning? We had a question in the chat about that earlier. Well, it's immediately after you plant. So that mango on the left right there, it's just been planted and it's got a new growth. So I would probably wait till that new growth hardens off and then I would tip it. And then when you tip it, it'll do what we see on the right. It'll have multiple stems. So we're going to look at in a minute. And when to finish, annual pruning is required if the tree size is to be maintained. So you never really finish. Kind of like being a parent. You think they're out of the house, but you still got a parent, still got to go. You never really finish. There we go. So how about year 1 and 2? So if a mango has its way, it's going to do that top left diagram there. It's going to go straight up. So what we want to do is tip it. So right where that dotted line is, we're going to cut it. And when you cut it, it breaks branches. Think about a hedge. When you cut a hedge, it comes out with many branches instead of just one. So we have these many branches now. We're going to select 3 to 4 that are looking good. And now the tree is going sideways rather than straight up. We have lower branches where we're going to get fruit. And if we have one branch we have one place to get flowers and fruit. If we have four, we have four places to get flowers and fruit. So we're going to do that. We're going to tip it. And then when the tree, when each of those branches get to be about 12 inches or 14 inches, we're going to tip it again. So here's a tree on the left, and it was tipped, and it was tipped multiple times. So look at that on the right. Now we have, instead of one spot to get fruit, we have maybe 20. So that's pretty good. So here we go, year 1, 2, and 3. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to do what I said. We're going to tip that middle one. Then we're going to tip the 3 or 4 that you have left over. And then that bottom diagram to the right, you're going to have multiple branches. So it's going to look like this picture on the right, multiple branches. So we want to do that tipping every time the branches get long enough. We want to do that for the first year and the second year, and maybe a little bit after that. When the tree gets to a size that we believe it can hold fruit, we're going to stop tipping. Because if you continue to tip, you're going to continue to get leaves instead of flowers and fruit. So we need to stop in that end of second, maybe mid-third year, and let the tree sit there, go into the winter, the dry season, like Jonathan mentioned, and then it's going to flower and hopefully fruit. So it's going to get less water, it's going to get no nitrogen, and then we're not going to tip it because pruning puts out leaves just like water and nitrogen does. So here we have year 2 and 3. The last tip pruning should be done in early September. This will induce one more flush. So this is like the last, we're saying goodbye to the tipping. Don't fertilize or irrigate, which I just mentioned. This will allow one last flush of growth, which will then go dormant when stimulated naturally to grow in December, January, February, and then hopefully we're going to get flowers and we're going to set fruit. So we're kind of tucking it away for the dry season with that last tipping. Now, after that, things get a little more difficult. Then we want to start looking for verticals, like strong verticals. So we want to get rid of those strong verticals, or we want to tip them. Then we're going to be doing some tipping as well after the fruit is picked. And the strong verticals, we want to get rid of those because we don't want that tree to continue to get taller and taller. So we're going to, instead of a tipping cut, we're going to go all the way down to the trunk and make what's called the thinning cut to get out that strong vertical. So mature trees, eventually the canopy will become too crowded. And Jonathan mentioned we want it open to light and air for many reasons: better production of flowers, better disease control, and eventually large structural limbs may form. So we're going to get limbs that are going to be pretty hard to cut because they're going to be big. So we're going to need to thin out the canopy. So you can do that by topping or hedging, which is done with machines. So in groves, they come by with these huge machines, look like circular saws, and just hedge the sides, and then they top the top. So you get a little square tree row. So you can also remove 1 or 2 entire major limbs back to the center of the tree. This is the thinning cut. And you're going to continue to favor horizontal limbs over vertical. So those strong verticals, we're going to take them out. And we never want to take more than about 30% of the canopy, if we can. And we're going to continue to shape and select limbs, new shoots annually. So renewing the canopy, here we have a tree on the top middle that has a little too much going on. So we're going to thin that out. We're going to thin out that where those 2 little black arrows are. We're going to thin that out. Now we have a lot of light. We're still going sideways, and a lot of air can get into there. What about a medium to large tree that has never been pruned? This is a question when I'm giving pruning lectures that I get a lot, and it's difficult to answer. So medium and high vigor mango trees may be kept at 15 feet tall. So what you want to do, if you have this bigger tree and it's never been pruned, you're going to begin an annual topping and hedging program where you cut the sides on the top, sort of like a hedge, or selective pruning to reduce tree height. So you're going to do more like what we saw here. We're going to take out one or two bigger branches. So these are selective thinning cuts, and you're going to use those a lot of times with topping and hedging, and this opens up the canopy to light. So you're keeping that tree smaller. You're going to need a topper or a hedger, so this is really for commercial growers. You're going to need pole saws, hand or power driven. I recommend power driven because the pole saws, it's hard to use because you're working above your head. It takes a lot of strength and endurance. Gloves, and then as always, you need a plan. Don't just go out there and go crazy. Look at the trees, think about it, decide what you're going to do, and then you do it. So the wider the spacing, the longer it takes to require regular pruning. These are in groves. The closer the plant spacing, the earlier pruning program is required because the trees are going to get on top of each other. That's another reason you need to prune, especially in groves, is because if you don't, the trees get on top of each other and they shade each other out. And shade is not good for fruit trees. Designing a pruning program for cultivars with a vigorous upright growth habit is more difficult than less vigorous. So we talked about the Angie, the Fairchild, things like that that stay a little more compact. So those are going to be easier to prune. I mean, I told you I only prune those every other year, if that. There's sufficient time for early season cultivars pruned immediately after harvest to mature the vegetative flushing after pruning than mid and late season. So you always want to prune after you get that last fruit off. But when you have those late season, like September fruiters, it's hard because you're pruning pretty late. So maybe don't take as much. I believe I'm going to pass this to Dr. Crane at this point.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
That's great. Excuse me. Okay, so a little bit about the mango's growth habit, and Jeff has been talking about that and alluding to it as well. So I mentioned this earlier. It's good to emphasize it. So you'll see that tree at the top, and you'll notice that the entire, almost every terminal on that tree is got a panicle on it. It's blooming, and that's what you want. And that's, you would call that tree is synchronized. All the shoots are doing the same thing at the same time. And this kind of synchrony can be induced by strong environmental conditions, such as cool weather during the fall and the winter, and or significant dry periods, right? Or both together. It's also done by pruning as well, because when you prune those shoots, as Jeff talked about with tree training, it stimulates the tree to all those terminals to flush at the same time. So the trees are synchronized, right? So what happens if you leave a tree and you don't prune it? As that tree becomes larger, the branching architecture becomes more and more complex. And as I mentioned before, you end up with a tree that's in the center there. It's an asynchronous tree. And you'll notice some of the shoots have these pinkish new leaves, young leaves coming out. Some have just old leaves. They're not flushing. And some of them are dormant. So you have this tree that's just a mess. And so at most, looking at that tree in the center, you would get maybe 20% of a crop or less. Whereas if the tree had been synchronized, it would be like the production would be like the tree that's been synchronized on the top, right? So you see this down on the bottom. Here's a tree that part of the canopy has fruit, and then part that I've circled in red, there's no fruit. And that's because that tree was not synchronized. The shoots were not synchronized, okay? Okay, let me go to the next slide. What's going on here? Okay. So, so the tree size control recommendation is to prune the early season cultivars as soon after harvest as possible. Same for many of the mid-season varieties. For some of the mid and the late varieties, you may have to design a program where you're pruning not every single year or the entire canopy every single year. So you might prune every third row canopy side every third year and top every third year, or top every year, but manage the canopies on the sides differently, right? If you're using mechanical pruning, and you can do this selective as well, but you want to have the trees somewhere, 15, 18 feet. You want to leave in a hedge more or less, and you want to leave a 5 to 8 foot row middle, right? So really, your trees should never be taller than 2/3 the distance between the rows, right? So if you have a 25-foot row spacing, you don't want the trees to be above about 15, 16, or 17 feet, right? If you do let them get too tall, the rows will begin to shade each other's canopies. And then you would lose, production, possibly lose canopy as well. And so again, selective pruning, as Jeff has talked about, you can do thinning out cuts to lower that canopy and to open up that canopy. The other thing too is some varieties are really dependent on the fruit being exposed to sunlight to develop a nice blush. And so if your canopy is too dense and too shaded, that fruit, even though it's good quality fruit, even though it may mature properly and everything like that, it may not develop the color that can help you sell that fruit, right? And it also, too dense of a canopy, you have a lot more disease and insect issues. This is just to show you a topping and hedging operation. And the picture up on the right, you can see the left row was topped and hedged. The row on the right was not topped and hedged. Okay. And then you can see on the bottom right, this is a grove where the trees were pruned on an angle, so they sort of have a Christmas tree shape. And this was to bring the canopy in and to synchronize the trees for the next year. This is sort of the schematic I was talking about, an alternating system. So you see year 1, year 2, 3, and 4, where you're doing parts of the canopy each year. So the entire tree is not out of production, and some of the trees are not pruned at all during any one year. So harvest and post-harvest, we'll talk a little bit about that. So you'll see that picture on the left, and what I'm showing there is the stage of fresh fruit maturity. The fruit at the bottom are much less mature than the fruit at the top, obviously, right? And you see the color of the pulp. And so fruit ripening actually starts next to the seed. That's where the first ripening occurs on mango fruit. So it's from the inside out. So the fruit maturity for many, in general is determined by, date roughly, this variety is usually early or mid-season, but also by the fullness of the shoulders and the cheeks. So if the shoulders of the fruit are very broad and the cheeks are round and swollen out, that's a good indication. Color development in some cases, for some varieties, can also indicate that the fruit is mature or nearing maturity. Same thing with fruit size. Color of the stem end latex. So when you pick a fruit, if the latex that comes out is clear, that generally indicates it's more mature than if it comes out and it's sort of milky. That would be less mature or immature still, right? Also, aroma is a good one too. Some fruit have a lot of aroma that give you a feel for it, and of course the flavor, right? It can also be determined maturity by days after fruit set. There's been some work, especially overseas, where they have some models and they have the data where they can actually calculate the days after fruit set, and it also involves temperature profiles during the fruit development period and things like that. They call that day degrees or heat units, right? Brix is also the measure of sweetness, can also indicate maturity. There's other detection systems. There's dry matter content, fruit firmness in some cases is pretty commonly used, and specific gravity. Internally, as I mentioned, the maturity occurs from the pulp adjacent to the seed outward. And so color development from white to yellow or yellow-orange indicates the ability to ripen, and therefore the fruit is mature, okay? So there is a good book that you may want to get. It's available on EDIS, the University of Florida's extension website. So if you type in your favorite search engine, capitals, it doesn't have to be capital, but EDIS, or UF, and then the next word is EDIS, you'll hit the publication website, the extension website. If you type in there mango post-harvest or mangoes, you will see this publication online. It was written, the main editor is Jeff Brecht, and then there are many contributors to it. It is an excellent guide on harvesting and post-harvest handling of mangoes, whether that's for the international trade or for the local trade. There's a lot of really good information. I'd encourage you to get a copy of this. And as I mentioned, it is online. This is part of it in here. So determining mango maturity, you'll see these charts on the right-hand side as examples. And they have stage 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So these are used actually in the international trade in a lot of cases to determine, when is this fruit ready to pick. And for them, it also is influenced by how far they have got to ship it, right? We have the advantage is that we are here in Florida. We're not having to ship our fruit, thousands of miles. So we can generally pick our fruit at a greater stage of maturity for higher quality fruit than fruit that has to be picked earlier at a lower stage of maturity because it's going to be shipped for many miles, right? So take a look at that and you'll see. I would say probably, a lot of the international fruit is being picked at stage 2, maybe some in stage 3. But here, locally, depending on how far it's going, depending on the variety, depending on many things, it may be picked at stage 3 or 4, right? And this is just more detail on those stages of maturity and what they generally mean, right? And this is for shelf life and for shipping ability. So the less mature fruit has a better ability to be shipped long distances than the more mature fruit. So I already mentioned a lot of this about generally picked mature on size, color, shoulders, internal pulp color. There is fruit that is marketed and sold immature at the immature stage, either baby fruit, so very small, or about half to a third grown, normal size grown. Kit is a pretty common one that's being grown here, primarily actually for the green market. So you want to pick the fruit as carefully as possible. It's a good idea to get the fruit in the shade as quickly as possible. You want it to cool off. Cooler fruit will have a longer post-harvest shelf life than fruit that is, kept at high temperatures, right? If you have access to a hydrocooler or forced air cooler, It's a good idea to bring the pulp temperature down as quickly as possible. It'll store and ship much better. Um, in general, the fruit are stored at about 55 degrees, 90 to 95% relative humidity. And then ripening temperatures is generally best somewhere between 70 and 75 degrees. And this is just showing you some picking here locally. And there's a picking machine on the right. There where you've got a bag that you can fill, and then you can release the bag into the bins. So some of the major diseases, at least I'm talking about Florida now. Of course, it occurs in other production areas, but Florida is hot and humid generally during the production season and the fruit development season. So it becomes very important. Anthracnose is a major issue, both on the panicles and on the flowers and on the fruit. I already mentioned powdery mildew can also be a major problem if we have dry, cool conditions, especially which occurs during the panicle emergence and flowering. Mango scab can occur. It's not super common, but it's just good to see what those symptoms look like. And let me just say, so disease control for mangoes is generally prophylactic. What does that mean? That means it's got to be done to prevent the disease, not to cure it. Once the fruit or the panicle has anthracnose, in general, you are not going to kill or stop or control that anthracnose. So that means that if you are going to use fungicides, that you would begin to apply them at panicle emergence, and depending on the variety and the environmental conditions, from panicle emergence on through to near harvest. So it depends. So here's powdery mildew, and you can see that gray color. And that's not going to set fruit and bear fruit that year. So I mentioned anthracnose is the major issue, and varieties vary in their susceptibility or resistance to anthracnose. And as I mentioned, your plant spacing of the trees, your pruning program, all influences how much disease pressure you will have. And that's the same thing with powdery mildew as well. Yeah, so chemical control of anthracnose and powdery mildew, you want to know the susceptibility of your cultivars. You want to pay attention to the weather conditions. You want to scout prior to and during the bloom. And if you need to make the fungicide applications, you need to read the labels, rotate the fungicides for resistance management. And we do have a handout that Jeff has put in the chat that just lists those conventional and organic pest control substances that are registered for mango production in Florida. So bacterial spot. This is a relatively new disease in Florida. It's actually a bacteria. And there's been quite a bit of observational information on the susceptibility to bacterial black spot. And so we have a publication on this, again, on that EDIS, University of Florida Extension website, with a lot of information about this disease. And here I'm just listing, susceptible cultivars, moderately susceptible, and resistant cultivars. And of course, your environmental conditions at your grove will also play a part in this, right? It is spread easily by wind-driven rain, infected propagation material, things like that. And so in some cases, windbreaks may be important in limiting the spread of this disease in a grove. And copper-based fungicides may have some efficacy in slowing or controlling this disease. But you can see it can ruin the fruit and actually attacks the leaves and young shoots as well. Mango malformation, not very common. It does occur. you can see the symptoms. So the picture on the top, that's a normal panicle, the shape of it. The one on the bottom, you can see it's this scrunched up, super compact inflorescence. It is infected by this fungi, this fungal pathogen. It is unfortunately spread by grafting material, but also pruning. So if you're pruning your trees by hand and you prune an infected branch and then prune a branch that's not infected, you have just moved that disease to that infected branch, right? So one of the easiest ways to control this disease, if you see it, if you see a panicle that looks like that bottom one, is to go in and cut that shoot off 3 or 4 feet back from that terminal, because the pathogen can live in that shoot section, and remove it from the grove, put it in a bag, and either bury it, burn it, or dispose of it. Don't leave it there. Then you also need to disinfect your pruning tool before you make any other pruning cuts. And that will control that. The difference between having a grove full of it in year 1 and then doing this pruning to remove it, and year 2, you've reduced it probably by 90%. So pruning is the easiest, simplest way to control this. And also you want to never select budwood from a tree that has shoots with these symptoms as budwood, because you'll just be propagating the pathogen and the problem. So some of the major insect pests, flower thrips, as I mentioned, can be a pest at high populations. Scales can also be a problem. If at all possible, you want to let the natural predators work. If you do need to control something, you want to use the least disruptive materials. You should be scouting and monitoring the grove. If you have an outbreak on 1 or 2 trees, control it on those 1 or 2 trees. It may not be necessary to treat the entire grove. So scouting and being out there and taking a look is a key component of an integrated pest management program. For chemical control of insects, again, you want to pay attention to the weather conditions. There are some compounds that if the temperatures are too high, you may actually have some phytotoxicity from the chemical. Key thing I mentioned before, scouting, but identifying what is the insect. You want to make sure the insects you see there are actually the ones that are causing the damage. If you need help with that, you can bring samples to our plant clinic here at TREC, or to one of the other plant clinics throughout the University of Florida, and have the insect or the disease identified first. Then if you decide to use an insecticide, whether it's a conventional or an organic one, you want to follow the label and the directions. You also want to rotate the materials, because insects can become resistant if you keep using the same material, right? Another type of issue with mangoes sometimes are disorders. And these are physiological problems. One is called mango decline, and I'll show you a picture of that. It suggests, there has been some suggestion that this might be caused by severe deficiencies of manganese and iron. And that by having these trees that are super deficient in these, it predisposes them to attack by some opportunistic fungi, which normally aren't a problem. And you'll see symptoms of leaf chlorosis. The tree is stunted, the terminals and the margins of the leaves are died back. There's dieback of young stems, and in some cases even tree death. So the tree is just really declining. You can, in some cases, recover a tree if you consistently apply minor elements to the tree to help it recover. Another one is called internal breakdown, and this is it's not been conclusively determined what causes this. There is some genetic inheritance with this. Some varieties are more susceptible to this internal breakdown of the pulp than others. Symptoms include a softening and a breakdown of the fruit pulp or flesh, at the distal end of the fruit, or open cavities at the stem end, or overripe flesh next to the seed, spongy tissue, gray-black color. These are symptoms of this internal breakdown. Here's mango decline, and you'll see the tree next to it is healthy. So, something was going on with this tree. Internal breakdown, just to show you some pictures. So you'll see the fruit on the left and the right, and that stem end cavity on the fruit on the right, right? In some cases, high nitrogen fertilization has been shown to worsen the problem. So again, a caution on your nitrogen fertilization. Calcium deficiency, it's thought that it is linked to calcium deficiency. There's been quite a bit of work to try to overcome that with applying calcium with mixed results. Also, sometimes over-irrigation of trees can increase this problem. So it's something, if you have the problem, you need to try to figure out some of the cultural practices to decrease it. In some areas where you have sandy soils, it could be that you need to apply a calcium or magnesium source to the soil to try to overcome the problem for the long term. Sap burn. This can affect, so when you harvest the fruit and that sap comes out, in some cases, on some varieties and in some environments, that sap can end up damaging the peel, which makes the fruit less attractive for sale. Some places, people wash the fruit. Some people leave a long stem on the fruit so that the sap doesn't ooze out onto the fruit, and they wait a while, and then they go ahead and remove the stem, and or they turn the fruit upside down and let it drain. It is labor intensive, but leaving a longer stem on the fruit for a while is not a bad idea. So some of the environmental stresses and management, so drought stress, and you'll see the symptoms there. Of course, solutions for avoiding drought stress would be a wider plant spacing, so the trees have more soil to explore for water and nutrients. Deep rooting can also help. Mulching the trees can also help, and of course, irrigation. Flooding solutions, the biggest solution is picking a site that does not flood, or putting the trees on beds, and or being sure that the ditches or the canals or the beds are contoured to improve drainage. In some places, people have had to put in subsurface drainage systems. Or if there's a hard pan, if you're able to go in and disrupt that hard pan to allow the water to drain through the hard pan. This is flooding. And so, as I mentioned, mango trees do have some tolerance to flooding, although I have seen young trees die under flooded situations. And of course, the reaction to the flooding will depend on the environmental conditions. So if we are super hot and for a long time, and we have flooded conditions, that may cause more damage to the tree than if it's cooler and we have flooded conditions. Okay, so it just sort of depends, and it also depends: is that water moving? So potentially it has some oxygen in it, or is it stagnant? That can also influence it. I can tell you that the trees basically, when they are flooded, they are not growing. The fruit is not gaining sugars. It is not growing properly, the development of the fruit, when the trees are flooding. And that's because the stomata on the leaves close and stop allowing CO2 to be taken up into the plant to produce the sugars that develop the fruit. So it's not a good situation, although the tree would probably survive. Fruit splitting, this is generally related to rapid water uptake. Some varieties of fruit are more susceptible to this problem than others, but it also may indicate some drought stress. And so what happens is that when the tree is undergoing drought, the fruit peel will stop growing or losing. Actually, what happens is the fruit peel loses its ability to expand. Those cells stop and lose that ability to expand. However, the pulp, those cells do not lose the ability to expand when they take up water. So what happens is the peel sets up like concrete, the pulp gets a slug of water either from a rainfall event or from irrigation, and then the cells expand rapidly and it bursts the peel because the peel cannot expand. It's lost its elasticity. Freezing temperatures. So I already showed you this at the beginning and talked to you that, the mature trees can take, basically around 25 degrees. The young trees, you're looking at damage or death, below 29, 30 degrees. And those are, typical symptoms. I'll show you some symptoms of freeze damage. Salinity is another issue in some areas, having to do with the quality of the water. And so again, site selection is key. Planting mango trees in saline soils is not a good idea, or using saline water because the trees just will not grow well or be thrifty or produce well. There are some tolerant rootstocks. Again, that's only a partial solution. It's a very difficult. The best thing you can do is to avoid a site that has salinity problems. This is freeze damage. These trees were about 10 years, 12 years old. There was tree damage down to about 4-inch wood from a freeze event. And so they did not have an irrigation system functioning at that time that could be used to help protect the trees. And so here is a grove with some freeze protection, and in this case is a high volume system because there was a lot of access to water. And you'll see the leaves and even the panicles covered in ice. These trees came through fine. I can't say that the panicles, even though they survived, set much fruit, but certainly the leaves and the trees came through fine. Cold stress, and I mentioned this too, if you have cool temperatures during flowering and fruit set, it can end up killing the embryo of the fruit. And you end up with these little nubbins or small fruit. And when you open up the fruit, you'll notice that the embryo is actually dead or dying. And this is an example actually in Ecuador where they had unseasonably cold temperatures, and they ended up with a lot of fruit on the ground. Salinity, and this is, I'm showing you the marginal necrosis on the leaves, which is a typical symptom. And there I have a chart that talks about water quality and the decicemens, or the total dissolved solids or parts per million of the different types of irrigation water. And you can see once you get into 2 to 3 decisiemens per meter, or 1,400 to 2,100 parts per million of salinity, you really can't use the water for irrigation. Windstorms. So I think we're all familiar with that. There are some issues with that, and I mentioned the main thing you want to do is have a good pruning program to limit the tree's height, right? High soil pH, which is common down here in the rocky calcareous soils down here. Rootstocks can help you overcome that. And also some of the fertilizers that are chelated can help you overcome those issues. This is from Hurricane Andrew. You can see the tree up in the top left. That was immediately after the storm. I would say about half the trees were completely gone, and and the rest of the trees looked like that. And then down below, you can see what the trees look like. In some cases, the trees in the background on that bottom picture have come back quite well. Some of the trees did not recover very well. So the nutrient content, this is just a general nutrient content from USDA and UF data. But there are a lot of antioxidants, anti-cancer components, and phenols in mango fruit. They're a very healthy fruit for people to eat. And that is it. There's the website for the extension publications. And Jeff, we can open it up to questions if you'd like.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was a huge amount of great information that you put together. And I really want to thank you for that. And